Okay. Good morning and welcome to this webinar, which is co-hosted by E3G and National Grid on green grids and the global energy transition. My name's Nick Mabey. I'm CEO and co-founder of E3G, which is a European climate think tank that works globally, and I'll be moderating the first part of this session. Really pleased to have the session today on this incredibly important issue. We've got a great lineup. Quite a lot of speakers, so it's going to go quite fast, but we will leave time for Q&A, assuming all the speakers stick to time, so we're going to be quite strict on you. Just to give you an idea of the agenda, so we're going to have an introductory session with Kate Hughes from BEIS and Sean Kidney, the founder of the Client Bonds Initiative, looking at some overall issues, and then we're going to go into two panel sessions, firstly on identifying and overcoming challenges, and secondly on how do we accelerate green grid infrastructure. And then in each of those sessions, we'll have some questions and answers. There's a Q&A function. Please use it. Please want to see some questions coming in. And then I will do some closing remarks at the end. So just a bit of context before we start. So E3G as an organization has worked on grid issues for around 15 years with a particular emphasis in Europe and a particular emphasis on North Sea's grid. And in fact, we held another event at London Climate Action Week yesterday looking at North Sea's grid issues. What we've learned from that, and it came out very much yesterday, that progress takes a lot longer than you think. We've been talking about a North Sea's grid for over 10 years with ministers agreeing they were going to do it, but still not moving. And it especially takes longer than you think if you're working across jurisdictions, actually inside or between countries. And it's more contentious with the public and other users, fishermen, for example, in the North Sea, than you think. So if you want to get the right grids, you have to start early and plan well and think hard about the politics as well as the technology. In the past 5 years, we've been working more globally, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Central and Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, and parts of North Africa. And I think what's come out of our conversations there, particularly in this last year, is that creating a grid that is strong enough to take large amounts of increasingly cheap renewables is the biggest barrier to countries feeling confident to increase their climate change ambition. And in many places, those grids do need to be cross-border. So we're stuck with advanced smart grids which cross borders, the hardest thing to do. So as we head towards COP26, a COP that, where the COP president said they want to make coal history, the issue of green grids is now a critical path. It's not just something that electricity system geeks like myself find interesting. It's actually a critical path for the whole global climate transition. We need to be able to do and install these new systems faster and better than we have in the past. And as well as, and it also, that means it should be, all those issues should be core to green recoveries from COVID, which obviously high on the political agenda this year, but will really move off next year in most of the world. We're seeing this in Europe. So it's a really critical time for getting this right. If we don't get it right in this pulse of investment, then we're unlikely to make the changes we need to hit the targets which are going to be set at COP26. So I'm really pleased we've got this great panel to talk through this. So starting in the opening session, I'm going to turn over to Kate Hughes, who's Director of International Climate Energy at BEIS. Kate.
Great, thank you so much, Nick. And I'm really delighted to be speaking here today on green grids and those links to COP26 that you highlighted and how that can enable the global energy transition. And whether you're from an industrialized, emerging or developing economy, there's a real shared and urgent challenge to accelerate the uptake of clean energy. And the IEA Net Zero report recently highlighted that to address climate change, we require a total transformation of our energy systems. We need them to be clean, dynamic and resilient, affordable, accessible and inclusive, and with our economies dominated by renewables instead of fossil fuels. And that report also highlights the rapid growth of electricity demand, rising by 40% from today to 2030 and by more than 2.5 times to 2050. So we've got that dual challenge of how do we match that increase in demand with also decarbonising our energy systems. And we need to look right across that whole value chain when we think about energy transitions, not just demand and supply in sort of separate boxes, but the jobs attached to these, how people use energy, the financing, the politics, technologies, markets and regulations, and often overlooked, I think, how we transfer that energy to the end user. We need to ensure that our grid systems are fit for purpose to deliver this secure, reliable and affordable power by incorporating a larger share of often variable renewable energy technologies. To do this, investment in electricity grids must triple to 2030 and then remain elevated through to 2050. So those are the challenges, but the good news is, as we will hear, I'm sure today, that we increasingly have the technology to do this, and it is becoming more affordable as well. We can see that transitioning to clean energy through investment in grid modernisation, enabling increased renewables into the system, will save money. Renewable energy has become cheaper than fossil fuels in nearly every country now. And over the past decade, large-scale solar has fallen by more than 85%, onshore wind by 56%, and offshore wind by almost 48%. Non-renewable projects in 2020 will save emerging economies, new renewable energy projects in 2020 will save emerging economies up to $156 billion over their lifespan and provide significantly more jobs than in the fossil fuel sector. And that's particularly important as we seek to sustain and make a sustainable recovery from the economic impacts of the pandemic. We've got to do these things hand in hand, as Nick said too. It's not just about move to net zero. We've also got to ensure that our economies are recovering and we are providing those jobs of the future. And even just yesterday, a new carbon tracker report said that 92% of coal facilities proposed or under construction globally would cost more to build than the future cash flow that they would generate. But the challenge remains the scale and the speed of the transition in which these changes need to be made in order to avoid dangerous and irreversible climate change. Greening grids and building out the associated infrastructure, networks, markets and institutions, including across borders and across regions, is the next frontier that we need to address. These measures will enable an expansion of renewable energy integration and energy demand. They'll provide accelerated energy access and set us on a more promising path to achieving global net zero. The challenges that these power systems are facing with integrating more variable renewables are shared by everyone on these challenges, everyone around the world, and they call for global solutions that are accessible to all. And so critically, to be really effective in this challenge, we're going to need to collaborate. And this is one of the key themes of our COP26 presidency. So we need to prioritise shared research and knowledge exchange. And following the completion of the world's longest undersea electric cable between the UK and Norway, we recognise how crucial interconnectors are to cutting emissions and boosting offshore wind. And we want to share that experience and others with others. And we're proud as the UK to lead many of these collaboration efforts together with China and Italy in the newly launched Green Powered Future Mission under Mission Innovation, which is aiming to create that toolbox of innovative solutions necessary to integrate up to 100% variable renewables into all of our power systems by 2030. And collaboration isn't just on those technologies. We need to work together across borders to support regional grid development through long-distance transmission and shared infrastructure, as well as scaling up green grids through smart meters, vehicle-to-grid charging, right through to those last-mile and community-owned projects and solutions. I'm looking forward to hearing more about these kinds of innovation and how to access them through this session today. And we know there are already some exciting international initiatives underway which are helping to build that greater access to the technical, financial, political and legal support for the energy transition. And these initiatives help to build the trust and confidence required to take the difficult political decisions and affect that whole systemic change that's required. So, for example, the COP26 Energy Transition Council, which is chaired by Alok Sharma and the UN Secretary General's Special Representative for Sustainable Energy, Damilola Ngumbaiyi, is working with many countries in Asia and Africa to find solutions to the technical, economic and social challenges posed by the clean power transition. And the Energy Transition Council has brought together governments and development stakeholders in each country to help identify really practical solutions to achieve that energy transition, including related to grid modernisation and development. We've got a new rapid response facility attached to that, which is about supporting governments and is funding technical assistance that enables and facilitates countries to access the larger development funding required to do these things. I just wanted to point quickly too to the G7, which showed their commitment in our communiques recently towards energy transition, including, for example, endorsing the Climate Investment Fund's new work to support coal transitions and renewable energy integration in developing countries, committing to provide up to $2 billion into those funds. And of course, to attract the necessary investment to achieve those economies of scale and the systemic change needed, green grid initiatives need to ensure long-term investor confidence. And recognising this, India's Prime Minister and the UK's Prime Minister have agreed to launch a global green grids initiative at COP26 to help accelerate the development of clean power systems, including India's One Sun, One World, One Grid vision. This Green Grids initiative will help support and scale the rollout of grid infrastructure and market integration needed to underpin this global energy transition. And we hope that the convening power of COP26 in November will showcase international recognition of that central role of green grids in decarbonisation. I'm sure this session will further our collective understanding of the role of green grids in this transition. We know that there are challenges, we know that time is short, but I think we can be really encouraged by the huge advances in technology and the real practical and political initiatives underway. We know we need to be ambitious, collaborative and innovative. And we know that if we get this right, greening the energy system will provide a more prosperous and sustainable world for us all. So I look forward to working with you through to COP26 and beyond on this exciting agenda. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Kate. That was wonderful and a great vision and lots of exciting initiatives. And I suppose now we turn to the cynical private sector financier, Sean Kidney, who's got a real pioneer in building private markets for capital, to tell us if we have to triple investment in grids till 2030 and then sustain that for another 20 years, how do we get the private money to flow? How do we make this an investable proposition, and what are some of the things we need to do to move that forward? Sean.
Thank you, Kate, for great introductory comments, and thank you, Nick, for that wonderful introduction. I haven't been called a cynical financier in ages, but I appreciate the confidence. You know, we have huge challenges. I think everyone's largely aware of that. What people don't realize, I think, is the import of the necessary commitments we've now made for 2030 over the last year. And the UK, of course, has got the most ambitious commitments of the lot. The major economies have committed to change within 9 years, not just within the next 30 years. Critical point. This is exactly what the IPCC in 2018 said. If we do not get global emissions down quickly, we lose our window to be able to influence the outcomes on the planet. We lose, if you like, the chance for humans to change the course of the growth of trajectory in a positive fashion, as distinct from a negative fashion we've been driving them so far. Now, part of that transition is going to require a massive electrification of the planet, of everything. In the green bond market, which is the sector I represent, we're the global NGO for green bonds, we've had a pretty extraordinary growth of a particular instrument. We're sitting at about 1.4 trillion US outstanding at the moment. The market will grow some 80% this year. In other words, extraordinary growth. Now, what this represents, if you like, is demand by investors for investments that will both provide them sustainable returns that meet their risk yield requirements and sustainable outcomes for the planet. This is a fantastic change in the last couple of years in the nature of investor demand. That, of course, is across all asset classes, not just bonds. The green bond market is the visible part of this, the most visible part of that. It's hard to track the other flows, as my friend Aboubakr at the Climate Policy Initiative will tell you. We launched the Net Zero Tracker a couple of days ago. The important part of what we have to do now is to make it easy for everyone to understand what are priority investments for the future. Let me give you an example about this. We've already seen in the green bond sector quite a lot of issuance from folks like Tenants in Netherlands, a grid company, building grids to renewable energy installations. Great, fantastic, more of that. But the appreciation of the need for general grid investments has not been there. When we spoke with a leading German utility about these new criteria last year, they said to us, oh, our investors won't believe this. We can't get the benefits of being labeled green, which are increased investor engagement, reduced interest rates, and so on, because people don't understand. And it is true that in the investor community, in the NGO community, in the government community before this new initiative that the UK and Indian government are leading, there's been a lack of appreciation of the important role of enabling infrastructure. Not grids that reduce carbon per se, useful, but the real point of grids in this particular transition framework is to enable a massive, rapid transition. We have to electrify everything. We have to get rid of fossil fuels everywhere. All cars, electric, or maybe hydrogen, but largely electric, not fossil fuels, but really quickly, for example. So in the European taxonomy, in the Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy, which are guides for investors, for issuers, and for central banks around the world. Note that Christine Lagarde and her introductory comments when she joined the European Central Bank talked about the need to link green quantitative easing to the taxonomy definitions that Europe was adopting. And we also serve on the UK working group that's looking at a UK taxonomy, which we expect to see progress in the next few months, that E3G is also a member of course. We need to make it clear. We are making it clear. We've made it very clear, a few key things. All new transmission and distribution infrastructure needs to be understood to be an enabling investment for the green future we're going into. We've included a whitelist, that is investments that are just in transformers and the like. We have got some exclusions. No, you cannot count a grid line connected to a gas-fired power station because you are enabling gas-fired power. There are a few exclusions along those lines. You have to address adaptation. You've got to be able to be looking at how the world is changing right now and going to change to make sure that your investment is consistent of addressing those changes. So adaptation planning is a requirement. And then finally, we have a broad caveat, which was we expect the grid to be on a trajectory to low carbon. There are some very simple metrics involved in that. But if you are living in a country or a grid where you're building more fossil fuel than you are building new renewable energy, you won't qualify. So there is a national grid caveat amongst all of this. The UK grid and the European Union grid qualify, just to be clear about this now. And many other major economies qualify, such as India, which has seen an extraordinary growth of renewable energy in the last few years, to the extent that we don't think there'll be any more coal in India. And we'll start seeing a closure of coal in the near future, which is very good news. So look, that's a bit of a sense of what we have to do. Enabling investments is critical. We've heard a little bit about the amount of money that has to be invested. We do think it does have to be a scaling up of 3 to 4 times per annum, really quickly. We saw a historic low of investments in grids last year. We're down to $248 billion globally, which is, at least on our figures, which is way, way short of the $822 trillion a year we need to be investing in the kind of grid infrastructure, including interconnectors, such as Kate talked about between Norway and the UK, around the world. So there's a lot to be done. We have to move capital. Our view is that capital is ready to move. It's very clear from the green bond market and the other markets that capital will invest when they're provided with investments that meet those two things, sustainability of the investment and sustainability of the asset. Of course, we need to educate them about what's involved. This is why we brought out very clear criteria. It's not just transmission and distribution, by the way. I want to stress battery storage, energy storage has got to be a critical part of this. Pumped hydro, which is 95% of energy storage on the planet at the moment, is already included in our criteria and the European criteria. So we can already do that now. Hydrogen storage will also need to be part of all of this. I think the key point about all of this is that the shape of the future is now very clear. And that's the, I hate to say, that term, but it is an outcome of what has been a brutal and difficult year for the global economy and global society. People now, governments now, are pretty committed to the change. And I think that the Biden Climate Summit and the commitments made there are a clear indicator of that. 2030 commitments are what counts now. But the speed also counts. If we don't shift our world, our economy, our electrical infrastructure fast enough, we will miss this window that the IPCC says we have, the next 9 years to get emissions down. Globally, on average, 58%. In the UK, 68% from baseline. That's what we have to do. And that, let's be clear, that's not an ambit claim. That's what we have to do to meet our goal, to create a chance of a sustainable future for our children. Grids are part of that. Watch this space. There's going to be a lot to move, but help us push the speed. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. And it's interesting that we're starting to see the way the investor community and central banks and public banks are looking at this should mean that if you have a country has strong planning and targets and structures around its grid, it should be able to access more and hopefully cheaper financing from the private sector, which gives perhaps the incentive to finance ministries in particular to help the transition along, which hasn't been there in the past. So I think that's a really powerful way forward, and it's great to see your new taxonomy moving forward, because I think this is part of the sleeping transition out there. The taxonomies have been working forward for the last few years. They're just starting to kind of, in a sense, hit the market and hit the politics this year. But hopefully from next year, they'll already be driving and shaping the capital markets. So great to have you here, and thanks for that. We're now going to move to our first panel, which is really looking at identifying and overcoming the challenges at the practical level to actually deliver the benefits which have been laid out by our first two speakers. And we're going to start with Aboubakr Benazzouz from the Research Institute for Solar and New Energies in Morocco, and then Elizabeth Press from Marina. Both of the speakers will speak for 7 to 8 minutes, and then we'll come back to Q&A from the audience. We've already got some coming in, so please add some questions in the press so we can run. We've got a decent amount of time for questions before we move to the second panel. So Aboubakr, if you want to say your piece.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting us to this interesting workshop. I'm very happy to represent my institute and to represent Morocco in this interesting event. Pauline, I need maybe to share the screen to show like the slides during my talk. Thank you. I hope you see the screen. So I'm supposed to speak today about like the main challenges for like enabling the global energy transition, and I will be speaking like from the Moroccan perspectives, and it's like important to perceive like the challenges like from like a North African country with like a different context. But I want to start like my talk with something positive. So here like a picture of the beautiful city like of Morocco, which is like Chefchaouen, the blue city with a special story. But this as well like give you an idea of how like the Moroccan low voltage network looks like. So the next slide. So first, just like a brief idea like about the local context in Morocco. So like Morocco is one of the countries in Africa with a very high electrification rate. So like we managed like to connect most of the country, like a program for the electrification of like the rural area like took place like 10 years ago, using like PV systems like to connect like even the most remote like villages in Morocco. The high and very high voltage are opens like for the integration of renewable energies. There is a law for that like put the frameworks and like provided access, and which is like important to accelerate like the development of renewable energy like in Morocco. But still like up to now like there is no access to the medium and the low voltage, despite like the political determination to do so. Morocco is like connected to Spain and Algeria, and there are like other interconnections like under studies, one with Portugal, another one with Mauritania. Otherwise, like recently, there has been some talk about like a future interconnection with the UK. Marine like grid interconnection, which looks like very interesting. There's nothing official up to now, but we spoke about like a capacity of 10 gigawatts using like wind and solar. There is no net metering policy yet, like in Morocco, for the low voltage and medium voltage. Smart metering programs has been like activated by the national grid operator for the medium voltage, but like for the low voltage network, still like studies are ongoing like on the best solutions. Renewables like represent like 34% of the installed capacity. We expect it to reach like 42%, but like some delays of the interconnection of like the wind and the PV power plants like deployed have maybe like delayed like the reaching the set targets. So speaking of the main challenges that we face like in Morocco, Pauline, if you can move to the next slide. So like the main challenges maybe that we face in Morocco to ensure like this transition. So first, like there's some kind of outdated infrastructure. And here I have to say, like in some regions, just not to make like somebody like upset, but we have to agree that some of the infrastructure was like maybe installed before like independence. So with like the growing energy demand, like this infrastructure is not able to deliver like the needed energy yet. And here, like the cost of infrastructure, this is something that we should like consider in order like to ensure like this transition. In Morocco, there's like an increasing energy demand, and for like many factors, so like population growth, the industrial activities growth, the development and the development like of the consumption habits, like are maybe like the main regions. And here like we have some concerns about like the energy security, whether we will be able like to deliver this energy, about the cost of infrastructure to do the upgrade and to connect like the other villages, and like the operation and maintenance costs for like this infrastructure. The third challenges, which is like the penetration of renewable energy. So like Morocco has a national renewable energy program which target like to ensure that 52% of like the total consumption is supplied by renewables, and this like penetration like raised like some concerns related like to the energy quality, like the stability issues, the energy security, and like the legal and the regulatory uncertainties. And here, like we have to say that that some like of the operators, the grid operators like Morocco, have some concerns in this regards, and especially this like penetration might threaten like their business model. There's like the fourth challenge is like electric mobility. So there is like governmental and political like determination to accelerate like this transition to electric mobility. We target to convert like 10% at least of like the Moroccan car fleet like to electric vehicles, and here like this raised as well like some concerns related to energy security, whether like the grid is able like to deliver and to cover this need, and then the cost of infrastructure. So the upgrade that the network like should be subject to, and as well the cost of the charging infrastructure. I mean, these are like concerns for like the grid. Then maybe like the final challenges is this integration of like new technologies. And here, like we do mainly have some concern about like the cybersecurity challenges, the capacity building, whether like we have qualified like personals to handle like these technologies, the market protection, how we can like protect the markets and make sure like we acquire like the best technologies, and then like the legal framework to use like these technologies. So like for some of the challenges, I mean, we have like identified, I mean, like some possible solutions that we are like addressing like as a research institute in order like to orient like the Moroccan stakeholders and like governmental like bodies. I mean, for like the outdated like infrastructure, I mean, it's like important to think about optimizing like the investments and the cost infrastructure, and then maybe like the use of decentralized energy grid, like using photovoltaic and storage, taking advantage like of the solar potential, could definitely like be like an optimum solution to decrease this length like of lines like to be replaced, or the amount like of transforming substations like to be upgraded. For this increase in energy demand, I mean, definitely the integration like of renewable energy and decentralized energy grid, I mean, propose like a great solution to target like this increase in energy demand and to limit like the consumption of like fossil energy sources. Smart metering and GIS tools could definitely like decrease the operation and maintenance costs, and then like this planification like of energy consumptions in order like to increase the penetration of renewable energies. I mean, could definitely like make us like in a better position like facing this increase in energy demand, and limit like the challenges related like to energy security. Then in regards like to electric mobility, I mean, it's like it's important at this stage, I mean, to do like a successful planification of the charging infrastructure, taking into account like two parameters. I mean, the first one is like the electric mobility potentials like in the region Morocco, but as well like the capacity of the grid. And then we have to as well like to promote the use of renewable energies for like charging like electric vehicles. The final point regarding like to new technologies, I mean, like Morocco has like installed right now and put in place like a research institute for development of capacity and expertise, training and testing of new technologies, and as well like the development like new technologies like adapted to Morocco. So in general, these are like the main challenges and maybe like the main opportunities to overcome like these challenges. I just would like to thank you again, I mean, for like the giving us like the floor to share like this feedback like from Morocco with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. Before we move on to the next speaker, just a quick question from me. I was really impressed by the number of international interconnections which Morocco has and is considering, as even inside Europe, the idea of relying on other countries for your energy security is highly politically contentious. And in areas like the Western Balkans, which have a history of conflict, which is also not unknown in your region, those issues become highly political. So just interested, you know, what's behind the more open approach Morocco has, which brings you economic benefits? How's that conversation about reliance or interdependence been proceeding in Morocco that's moved to that?
Yes, and thank you, Nick, for bringing this point, because I need to clarify, we are not like heavily relying like on interconnection with other countries. So like the exchange is very limited, like with Spain and Algeria. Maybe like back in the years, like with Spain, maybe the exchange was more like interesting than now. With Algeria, like the exchange like is bidirectional, but like our motivation, especially to connect like to Europe, is like to ensure this like transfer of renewable energy to Europe, and this is the case with the UK. So like the UK want to deploy like a capacity of 10 gigawatts using wind and solar, and this energy like to be transferred to the UK to be consumed like in the UK. So like Morocco, I mean, would love to play some kind like of a bridge between Africa and Europe for like transferring like renewable energy and transferring as well gas and like other like energy sources. So like this is the main motivation. In the south with Mauritania is like the other way around. I mean, the grid capacity like in our like southern border like is not yet like developed, and maybe like Morocco could like support it to make it like more reliable, and this creates as well like an opportunity for us. I just need to mention as well like the Moroccan grid operator, which is like ONI, has been like involved in other like African countries, transferring expertise and supporting like other African countries to develop like their grid infrastructure.
Thank you. It's a really interesting kind of chain model of cooperation, you know, going through Morocco into Africa. Really interesting, as well as kind of importing and exporting stability and resources. Perhaps Morocco is the only country which might be positive towards the European carbon border adjustment measure, as will make your renewable energy more competitive than high carbon energy going through. Thank you so much for that. We'll come back for questions. And I'd like now to move to Elizabeth Press, who's the head of planning and program support at IRESEN. Elizabeth, your views on the challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, and it was really interesting to listen to all the colleagues. I find it so refreshing that we are having a conversation when there is a convergence of views, because for years, you were fighting these misconceptions around renewables, and now I think there is pretty much an agreement that renewables, efficiency, and electrification will be the key elements of decarbonized energy future, and we can really get on with focusing on how to get there. And we released yesterday the World Energy Transition Outlook, and so obviously, I mean, there's a 1.5 degree scenario in it, but we also focused on what are the policies, what are the financing structures, how the finance landscape needs to change in order to accommodate this shift towards the system that is not a fuel replacement. It is actually a different system. And that is what we're discussing today, because the interconnectors and regional integration becomes a lot more relevant for a whole host of technology reasons. And I think the Aboubakr highlighted many very, very practical and important issues, and I will not repeat it, but I want to reflect on a few, on the experience that we have had in the past decade, because we work with quite a few regional initiatives so we call them clean energy corridors. They're basically market integration in different areas. So the oldest one we worked with is Africa Clean Energy Corridor, which basically is combining two power poles, the Eastern African power pole, the Southern African power pole, and it's basically Cairo to Johannesburg, a link. And when you look at the potential, what renewable potential exists in that part of Africa, really the combination is a powerful potential to have a green grid in that part of the world. We also have another initiative in West Africa and the Central America, and the newest one is the Northeast Asia power system interconnection. So I'm going to focus on Africa because I think it's the oldest one that we have, and I can share the most insights from my experience, and also to reflect that the African Union now has made a couple of really foresighted decisions. One earlier this year to actually have a continental master plan. Which is going to provide a framework for their power sector development, and more recently they decided to have a unified power market, which are really huge steps in there. And we're very happy because IRENA in-house model has been selected to help them model the continental master plan. And that's why I want to focus also on the experience that we had since 2014 in this Africa Clean Energy Corridor on the eastern and southern part. So in terms of greatest challenges, I think they're quite consistent with what we already heard until now. We recently did the reassessment of what exists in these power poles, the Eastern and Southern Africa power poles, and we found that there is about 100 gigawatts of new coal-fired power based on the existing power pole master plans that would be installed by 2040. And I mean, it's very worrisome, as you can imagine, and it would basically triple the CO2 to 1,200 megatons per year between now and 2040. I mean, it's a serious problem. So we're trying to see how you can provide a business case and for competitive renewables, because they do have competitive renewables, and and the combination between geothermal and hydro potential and solar and wind in that area is just really they're blessed with amazing potentials. So there are a few problems that we see. That number one is misconception. There is still this perception that renewables are unreliable, that you have to have base load, and that the flexibility is not very well understood because there is still this thought that everything is going to be solved with the holy grail of storage, and the market solutions are not very well understood, and that is a huge problem. And I think we all collectively have to do a lot more work to raise awareness and inform policymakers, especially those who are not near experts, how this works. The second problem that we see is really the lack of infrastructure and the infrastructure that is compatible. And I don't want to dwell on it because Aboubakr covered it very well. The importance of interconnectors, and linked to them the importance of regulatory frameworks, enabling frameworks that allow for energy trade, that are consistent, that they talk to each other. And this enabling framework that also has a predictability in terms of plans, in terms of targets, in terms of collaborative agreements that give stability for the investment and scale. And back to Sean's presentation on what is required and how do we attract this investment. In our outlook, we made it 2 points. One, we know the bulk of the finance, about 80% of finance, has to come from private sector, and the way that finance structure between debt and equity has to change because of the nature of what we are doing in terms of deploying renewables in scale. But the second part of it is also the role of public investment. How do we use the public funds strategically and to leverage the great investment to provide stability and to provide the de-risking upfront that will be necessary to trigger the scaled up investment of private sector. And this is going to become an issue as we go forward, because there is a lot of discussion around how we need a pipeline of projects, which is true. But the bigger issue is infrastructure, because unless you have infrastructure that can allow for the concentration of different sources of energy and the deployment of variable renewables, that can be managed flexibly through both market policy and technology solutions, we will not get far. So I think this is if there's one thing that I would like to highlight here is really to focus on the infrastructure in the coming years, and the rest will come with focus, with repeated business case business case models that they're emerging all over the world that can be replicated, deployed. And my very, very last point would be on the cost. The cost of renewables renewables are competitive. There is absolutely no question around the competitiveness with alternative sources. We just issued a report that shows that coal absolutely cannot sustain the cost trajectory of renewables. But that is a starting point. It's not the end point. We should not understand that the competitiveness of renewables to be now the panacea, the solution for everything. It is a starting point. We now have a competitive alternative to the business as usual, and we need to really accelerate action in all different sides, not least the policy side, to enable high share of renewables in grids. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. I think that's a good point, that just because the renewables are cheap, it doesn't mean that it's easy to get them onto the grid, and that's the only thing we need to do. There's a question which has come through, which either I think Kate or Elizabeth or both of you may want to talk to, that and I'm going to read it out. So, increasing shares of renewables in Germany and California has raised the spectre of blackouts and fuel poverty. How are we going to do better in the UK and I'd say elsewhere? Now, I'm sure some of you may contest the beginning of that question and its implication, but does Elizabeth or Kate, do you want to take that as the first question from the audience? Elizabeth, perhaps?
Sure. I'm happy to do that. And again, it would be good to understand where this assumption comes from. When you look at what happened during the economic downturn last year in 2020 in Europe ran on renewables. It basically, there is very clear empirical evidence that shows that variable renewables were the preferred source of fuel, and that there was no blackouts. So it would be good to know what exactly we're referring to in this question. And I think this feeds into the point of like we're in a transition, and I think there is a lot to be done in raising awareness and understanding better how the system works, and how the costing structure, how the financing structure works, and who bears what expenses. I think the point on subsidies of renewables and being passed to consumers is probably in some way fair from the German experience in the beginning, because there was a lot of issues in the beginning. But I think that there is probably a phased out issue as well, as the renewables move towards more the auction-based, market-based structured. And again, I don't think it's comparable with the level of subsidies that go to fossil fuels. So it's dwarfed compared to, the fossil fuel subsidies amounts are enormous. So that the market really is not set out to account properly for renewables. So I will stop here.
Yeah, I think one thing which also isn't picked up in the press much is that the cost of renewables in Germany was only put on domestic and commercial consumers, not industrial consumers. So unlike in the UK, where it was spread more evenly across different types of consumers, so it showed up rather more strongly on people's bills than in other countries. That was a policy choice. That wasn't a kind of natural thing. In terms of blackouts, I think actually what California has shown us, particularly with the forest fires, is the vulnerability of grids, and thinking about grid. Sean talked about it. You need a grid plan, not just for net zero, but for surviving in a climate change world. And if you look at the heat waves in Portland and other places at the moment, they're not running their streetcars because the electric cables that drive them are melting because they weren't designed for this level of heat. So again, these are some of the challenges, and not just from where we're going in terms of emissions, but where we are in terms of climate change.
Yeah, and Nick, if I may just add one tiny point to this, because it's absolutely pertinent point, and that we also need to start talking about energy system in adaptation. When you see what happened, not just mitigation, but also how do we adapt to the changing patterns. What happened in Texas, for instance, with the freezing of the gas pipelines and the blackouts and suffering that caused the population in Texas just a few months back is also something to consider. Nothing to do with renewables.
Great. So actually we have Craig Dyke from National Grid has just joined us. And so I think Craig will have views on both the question about how the UK will make sure costs are fair and blackouts are avoided. But also there's a question about how much we think the renewable transition will be driven by kind of big centralized investment through National Grid, and how much through more distributed models. So Craig, I'm sure you have views on both.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I guess I've been called in earlier than expected, but it's a good question. And the bit we always talk around regards the UK experience is it's the cultural shift. And this going back a decade or more in the UK, where not just the grid system operators and the regulators and the market, but government and everyone had to buy into the fact you could move to this renewable energy transition space and actually believe you could make it work. And that's the big thing. You have to believe you can make it work, but also then show and demonstrate action that things can happen and you can operate the network and the market and everything will work fine. But certainly for us, certainly the electricity system operator part of National Grid, we've got some significant programs we've rolled over the past few years to help manage this transition. So increasing participants in some of our markets and also the overall markets as well. Looking to find new ways of operating the network. So new voltage sources, new stability sources, new ways of managing constraints on the system. And when you add up all these things, you can actually demonstrate that tangible action, which you can show to consumers by minimizing costs, can actually make this whole transition to renewable energy work. So I think it's all about a cultural belief, but also having a tangible action and target that can make it happen, such as the ESO's target to operate the network carbon-free by 2025. By demonstrating that, it allows you to actually set more ambitious plans. So we would have seen earlier this week where there's now the plan to bring forward that phase out of coal in the UK from 2025 to 1st of October 2024. So by demonstrating it can be done, you can actually stretch yourself a little bit further and actually move quicker into this renewable energy space.
Great. I'm going to turn to Aboubakr and Elizabeth, who has to leave sharp at 10. for two questions, one from me and one from the chat. On the chat, it's about, is it true that even though renewables per kilowatt hour look cheaper, the system cost overall in Africa, this is particularly, is greater than for other energy sources, or is that not true? I would like to start with one which came up in your talks. You talked a lot about demand. So demand growth essentially swamping the rising renewables capacity. So we keep fossil on even though we're building lots of renewables and moving because demand growth is rising so high. E3G works a lot globally on cooling, and cooling is one of the largest drivers of demand growth in the majority world, particularly because of climate change, particularly on peak power. And we're looking at, most countries sell air conditioners at a third of the efficiency they could. So really inefficient air conditioners, which is driving that growth. There are other reasons too. So just interested in your perspective on, how do we get efficiency on the demand side to give us space to build the renewable energy systems? Because otherwise we'll end up with green-brown systems and too much energy demand. Seems we've had a lot of discussion of grids, a lot of discussions of smart, but not so much discussion about how do we keep demand growth contained enough that we can make the changes we need without having to build a lot of inefficient bridging fossil capacity or not getting fossil off the grid faster. So Aboubakr, I'm sure this is something which you consider in Morocco, given it's not unknown for its heat at some times of the day, and you have very fast growing power demand at the moment.
I mean, yes, that's true. I think you put the finger exactly where it hurts. Despite all the efforts that maybe Morocco and other countries are doing in order to increase the share of renewable energy, this will not be enough to limit the share of fossil energy sources if we keep the same energy habits, and if the energy demand is growing with this speed. So that's why I mean two things are very critical, and especially for African countries. I mean the first one is energy efficiency. I mean this is an interesting topic, and it's very critical in order to ensure this energy transition. The second one is the direct use of renewable energy, and this is as well in a critical area in which saving could be made, and as well infrastructure cost optimization. I mean could be made. I mean these are maybe two critical elements that we are considering right now in order to ensure this transition. For instance, Morocco, I mean has started to do so for the industrial sector. So there's certification program that all industrial should go through to certify that they are energy efficient, and that they fit to some terms and to some norms. This is a first step, and then the second step is addressing the residential sector. And this will be definitely challenging, but at least if there's a legal framework that address the new building, the new constructions, and to impose some norms and standards to respect in order to be energy efficient. This will definitely help limit a little bit the energy demand. 10 years ago we were speaking about raising awareness, but I think this is not concern anymore. I mean people are at least here in Morocco, people are developing more concerns about the environment and about their energy habits, and trying to reduce their energy bills. So two things: energy efficiency and direct use of renewable energy. I mean I think two things are the key for this transition.
Great. And Elizabeth, interested in your view, and also on this idea that about the kind of cost of renewables in Africa. Are they cheaper as a system, or as they appear in the books?
Yeah, so I also want to echo what Aboubakr said, because without efficiency we're chasing our tail, and we should not speak about one thing without another. It has to be this holistic approach where we look at all these things together, and it's a little bit linked to the question of costs, because if we only look at the costs of technologies, it is not the way to approach this. You really need to have a more holistic policy making that looks at different aspects of the energy system, how it impacts deployment, that's for sure. Then the second layer of how it impacts system, the third layer how it impacts your labor, and the fourth the economy as a whole. And then when you take this holistic approach, and Morocco is an excellent example because it works because they're also looking at the economic benefits. They're looking what makes sense in terms of value chains, how to maximize local capabilities, and you have to look at all of this at once. And it is super important for the global south because many of the countries will have to upgrade the infrastructure or build it up, expand it, because it doesn't exist. So regardless of what source of fuel you use, you will require this infrastructure. And looking forward and understanding how the renewables-based systems, not to call them renewable energy, but renewables-based systems, can help you also develop different value chains and maximize local benefits is going to be absolutely critical. Just to reflect, for instance, on the hype around, policy focus on hydrogen, we will see which way it goes. But you can see Morocco is already benefiting from its own green infrastructure and having these agreements with the different countries and the European Union on future demand of green hydrogen. So having this sort of like a larger approach that accounts for different economic aspects of the change in energy will change the financing outlook for the system. And the final point on Africa, we still struggle with the risk perception around renewable energy. So there's a lot of finance in addition to the shift from between OPEX and CAPEX. How you create this project. There's a perception, real or imagined that there is a high risk around renewables. Sometimes it's related to political risk. Sometimes it's related to financial risks, and sometimes it's just not understanding the new system very well. And this is where, again, public finance can help a lot, especially like the IFIs and in the short term, the bilateral assistance that might come to really help unclog that and overcome the risk perception that can help countries advance at a faster pace.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. I know you have to go. Thank you, Aboubakr, for that brilliant panel session. I'm going to finish off this session with a question back to Kate Hughes, who started us all off with the importance of this whole issue in the context of COP. And also to come back to you and say, we're a few months away, a very short months from Glasgow. What would you like to see in Glasgow, and also perhaps coming out of Glasgow, in terms of action on this sort of broader energy transition and the role of grids moving forward? What's your dream scenario moving forward this year?
Great, Nick. Well, what a question. And I could probably talk about this for an hour or more, as I'm sure you could, and others on this call as well. Look, I think you pointed to it right at the start of this session too. I think for us, this is about how do we really shift the world and accelerate that transition to a coal-free future globally. And what does that look like, and how can we actually make that a reality? And lots of things need to come together to make that a reality. So we need those commitments from countries to no new coal, and that's accelerating. We're seeing commitments from Malaysia, and just this week, and a bunch of other countries. The G7 made some huge commitments, but we need to consolidate that. Aligned with that, we need to make sure the finance is moving in the right direction, public finance, but also private finance, and Sean was talking about some of this too. We need to make sure the financial systems are working in this direction, and we're working together and making sure those incentives are right as well. There's something to here, and I mentioned it about collaboration, because none of this happens in isolation. We can't deal with this in silos. So just to say, and this is where the grids part comes in, the technology, actually thinking through these things as whole systems. So bringing people together to share that knowledge, and you just asked a question too about energy efficiency, and pointing to that. And we've got the Super Efficient Appliance Directive, a call to action on major energy using products too. So we're tackling that side of things as well as the whole grid point that we're talking about today. So we can actually make it a reality. And I think, you know, what we'll be looking for is for countries and businesses and investors to show us the real life situation on that. And the final point we're really keen to make sure that we're delivering on at COP and beyond is the just transition point. This only works if we're doing it in a fair and inclusive way, and we're thinking about the jobs, we're thinking about the growth, and that's absolutely critical. So we want everyone to come forward at COP, showing us, demonstrating the commitments they're making, and commitments are important, but also setting out their plan in how they're going to deliver this by COP and also beyond COP with that sense of urgency. Thanks, Nick.
Brilliant, Kate. That's a great place to end. And I think this issue of inclusion within countries in terms of the offer to everybody, both workers and consumers, feeling they're getting a fair deal out of this transition, but also between countries. And I think the conversation about Africa is really important. We often talk a lot about the big coal using countries and how they have to move. But Africa is the continent with the largest number of unserved people. And we need to have a clear offer towards Africa that show it can industrialize and increase its prosperity and increase the welfare of its population without having to go through a heavy fossil, without those 100 gigawatts of coal plants being built. So that's a, you know, I think it's that social contract perhaps at the heart of the whole of how we need to move forward globally. That was a brilliant session. Thanks so much to all the speakers for your work. I am now handing over to Craig Dyke to run the second session. I'll be back at the end with some reflections, but thank you very much. And over to Craig.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I think we've got a 3-minute break now, so you've got enough time to quickly grab a coffee, tea, fruit tea, water, apple, and I think we are then coming back at 10:05, so we shall start 10:05 promptly. Okay. Okay, there's my prompt. Hello, welcome back, everybody. So we've heard in the first hour this morning a lot of the key challenges around moving to a renewable energy system, not just at local level, but global level, and that big need for sharing and collaboration. And then it was touched upon several times about the role of financing and the role of grids in making it all hang together and making it work. This next session will sort of dive a little bit deeper into that. So I've got the honour, I guess, in one way of doing the introduction and also chairing the session. I'm delighted to sort of be joined this morning by Jaji Serene, who's the Assistant Director of International Solar Alliance, Catherine Dixon, Chief Counsellor for Transition Partnerships at the IEA, and Priyantha Wujitanga, Director of South Asia Energy Division at the Asian Development Bank. So we're going to have a good session for the next 50 minutes before Nick returns and closes this morning's session. I've got a few slides I'm just going to cover off myself. I think the bit I want to try and get across the first initial context, and Pauline just put the slides up, is around setting that overall context. So very recently, the electricity system operator at the National Grid launched a report. So move to slide 2, please, Pauline. Let's get some animation running. So just click on the play at the bottom. So we launched the Road to Zero Carbon report in June 2021, which was last week. And it's worth having a look at that. It really sets out where we've been over the last few years, but also where we're likely to go as well. So what this shows is that transition from coal to renewable energy. So we would have seen that initially the government announced that we were going to close all coal-fired power stations in 2025. That was recently changed and moved to 2024 just this week. The blue charts, these slides are running a lot quicker than I actually expected. Is there a way we can slow these down, please, Pauline? Okay, let's just go with it and see how we get on. So what we'd have seen is as we drive the renewable energy into the market, you see actually this transition from dark colored on the slides to actually blue. What the blue demonstrates is when we've had our first transition of 24 hours without coal free, which is April 21st, 2017. Moving into what we saw last week in 2020, where we ran for over 50 days consecutively without running coal. That record was actually broken by a coal-fired power station actually looking to run maintenance. And then actually we had a further 67 days of running coal-free. Maybe we forget that. Maybe we forget the slides on this. Maybe it's not working so well. And we would end up with 120 days, so without consecutively running coal-free. And what we saw last year, with a drop-off in demand, that actually 2/3 of the year, with regards to an hour's perspective, with no coal running. So it just demonstrates from making that decision, government decision back in 2015 through to 2020, you move from a year where there's 0 hours of actual coal-free days to actually a place where there's over 5,000 hours. It just shows what can happen in a short space of time. And that's not just from the policymakers as well. So that was set by government, targets set by government. It also required the market to react. It required the electricity system operator to react as well, to undertake and develop new tools and new services to the market. And why is that really important? Because it demonstrates that it just can't be done by one party alone. It takes a collaboration, not just within the energy sector, but more broadly across the political sector, at the regional, national, and a global level as well. I think we could probably do away with the slides now. We can share these afterwards. And what the COP26 Energy Transition Council is aiming to do is look at ways to accelerate this shift from coal to clean power. And that's moving from industrialized countries, where spearheaded by the Power and Past Coal Alliance, and also developing countries as well. We talked about, it's all about inclusion and having an offer to all. And this is the way to accelerate the uptake of renewables, avoiding the need for new coal plants as economies and demand for energy continues to grow. And we've always spoken about it as well. So this is a shared challenge across all nations. But it's also recognizing as well that everyone is starting from a different position. So whilst we can use the UK and European networks and markets as a great place, as a great case study, many of the nations, regions, and systems and networks across the world are starting from very different positions. So it's not about taking up one thing and just dropping it somewhere else and making it work. It's about helping us all understand what actions we can take in our own areas so that we can actually drive that transition ourselves. And a lot of that is, this isn't just, I know we spoke a lot about UK, this isn't just a UK position as well. So clearly we're going to move on to something, the International Solar Alliance very quickly, which is, but we've seen recently the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, talking a lot around one sun, one world, one grid. And that's all about how we're going to harness renewable energy across that band of solar, recognizing the sun will be shining at any one point in time across the world. How can we harness that to make best use of that at the global level? We also would have seen as well, back in May, Prime Minister Modi and also Prime Minister Johnson as well agreed to launch a Green Grid initiative at COP26. And that's all about setting out the importance of demonstrating what grids can do to help this transition at global level to get more renewable energy on the system. And they've cut it up into 3 pillars. The first pillar is about that political will. So you have to have that political will to make it work. And again, that's not just within nationals, but across nations as well. So having that collaboration at the political level, the political leader level, is absolutely important. The second pillar is about getting major international institutions such as your banks, technical agencies, the IEAs and arenas of the world together so we can actually collaborate and make sure the regional national initiatives are all joined up. If we join those, we'll have to recognize it fundamentally. We all have the same problems, but the same solutions can be applied elsewhere. And the third pillar is all about aiming to accelerate some of the research, development, and demonstration cooperation across green grids. So more that peer-to-peer support, whether that's system operator, network owner to network owner, regulator to regulator, recognizing that we can actually share at a local level, again, at a global level, a lot of the good practices going on along the world. And ultimately, if we can do that, we can drive and make sure the green grids have got a significant role to play in this global transition and help hit some of the targets and no doubt will come out of COP26. So the whole purpose of green grids is to actually help achieve this pace and scale of reforms. Now, I don't want to take too much of my time, conscious I'm introducing and chair, so I'm going to stop at that point. And I'm now going to hand over to Jagjit from International Solar Alliance, who's going to talk through some of the significant challenges. How do you make that work at a global level and how they work across technologies to make it happen? Over to you, Jagjit.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks to E3G for putting this fantastic event and assembling this panel. I really feel very privileged part of this panel with Catherine and Priyanta. I'm assuming everybody is aware about what International Alliance is, but maybe just 30 seconds bringing everyone up to speed. So International Solar Alliance is an intergovernmental organization now with 95 member countries which have signed up to the treaty. Essentially, the idea is to push for solarization of the globe. Push for solar to be the preferred source of energy by policymakers and politicians when they look at next power plant, next source of energy, and addressing issues of energy access, energy transition, and energy security in their countries. So that's kind of the mission and vision of ISA, and we have been in existence for the last 4 years. It's been a kind of a ship which is sailing as it's being built. Many new initiatives are coming out of this political platform, which is now an institution, ISA. So Craig, you laid out the case for greening the grid and interconnecting these greener grids. With that as a context, maybe I will present to this group. The idea which we are pursuing is one sun, one world, one grid, which might sound like a mouthful, but if you break it down to basic principles, it's very simple. That sun shines, all the time on planet Earth. Maybe it's it's not shining that bright in one place, but you go across the country or continent, it's shining bright there. And the trick is if we could interconnect these sources of power to the demand centers of power, with sun being one source, and through these interconnections, you can bring all other renewables. In our world at ISA, we call them solar derivatives, whether it's the wind or hydro, or now the combinations. So essentially what you're looking at is push for greening the grids, push for more regional grids, and then push for interconnections of these grids. From Solar Alliance, we are not taking a monopoly on all renewable energy through solar. We are saying, given what the science, what we see coming from IEA and IRENA, solar is going to be more than 50% of the solution as we move forward, both in photovoltaic and also heating, cooling, and others. So just on the power source side, if solar is the key, let's use it to expedite the energy transition we are looking at. Let's put some speed in our race to net zero. In continents like Europe, interconnection is already a reality. It's been a reality for decades, and now only efficiency gains are coming in. We see more undersea cables transferring electrons from one country to others as well, from Norway to UK and others. Can that become reality for other continents? So in 2018, Honorable Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, laid out this vision, one sun, one world, one grid. And the way he put it out before countries is sun never sets. Can we use sun as a battery, as a live battery, interconnect countries, interconnect continents, so that our energy source becomes primary energy source becomes sun, and we get it 24/7 solar energy. And that's a very powerful idea. Craig, you talked about political will. It seems the political will is there, but we need to make it economical and technically feasible as well. Of the advancements we have seen in HVDC lines, even in undersea cable HVDC lines, it seems that it's becoming commercially viable. Just one example to throw in the discussion, you guys may have heard of Sun cable proposal connecting Australia to Singapore. I was just watching a video from yesterday where Prime Minister Morrison was talking about Australian full support to this idea, with solar power plants gigawatt level in Northern Territory, and through undersea cable coming to Singapore, and then maybe connecting with all ASEAN. At our end in 2020, this idea was brought to the Assembly, ISA Assembly, where all our member countries endorsed this as a multilateral initiative and requested, working with the World Bank and the Government of India, the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, to do a careful technical and economic viability study for this idea, so that we can make a solid economic case rather than just leaving it at a vision level. The second part of this mandate was to not leave it at that, but also explore 2 to 3 pilots, at least at a pre-feasibility stage, look at the basic techno-economic feasibility of 2-3 pilots, and then also propose institutional arrangement to take it forward. Minister Alok Sharma, then designated CAW president, addressed the Assembly and provided full support to this initiative. As we have moved forward from there on, this idea of a global green grid initiatives coming from the presidency has gotten a lot of traction. The way Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Johnson have agreed that this initiative would be pushing to the realization of the vision of one sun, one world. Maybe what will come out of ISA would be a first edition or first manifestation of the Global Green Grids Initiative in terms of concrete projects. Now, let me come, put on the table the timelines we're working on. So we hope to bring to Glasgow a detailed and final economic and techno-economic study, which conclusively would present that yes, it's possible, and there is an economic and financial case, and technically we can do it. So that it settles once for all that it's not just mere vision. If we want to do it, here's the plan to do it. It would be a global study. We would be looking at all the current interconnectors, Europe, of course, but also different power pools in Africa and North America, and other studies which have been done also in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, this Australia, Singapore, and other initiatives. In last decade, we have seen Desertec and various other initiatives. So all that distillation would provide us good lessons how this vision could be realized. And we have assembled a team of best brains to do this work, led by EDF France, which the last time I checked was largest utility in terms of installed capacity and in dollar terms globally. So they are bringing not just a high level analytics, but a practical experience of doing this. They have done these interconnectors, various regions, various cross country. So a very experienced team is looking at this question. Similarly, they will explore 2-3 pilots. To begin with, we are looking at if it's again, techno-economically possible to connect Oman to west coast of India, which is the shortest route if you want to connect Middle East to India. And through Oman, you can connect to GCC and the broader Middle East. Also, we are seeing if from India, if one could connect to Myanmar and then Vietnam and connecting down to ASEAN, if that is possible. There are various other initiatives which we are in detailed discussion with, which are currently exploring this, like BEIS, the connection from India down to Bangladesh and Myanmar. But also India, Sri Lanka, between ASEAN and various other things. In this process, we are talking to all stakeholders. In our partnership with the Global Green Grid Initiatives team and the ETC, we are working now with African Development Bank to do a detailed consultation in Africa region and learn from there. Similarly, we'll be working with ADB to see what we can learn from ASEAN and beyond and beyond.
Sorry, Judge, I just call you there. We just timed out. Apologies, but we'll come back because I'm quite interested to understand what this study looks like. I think you're right. Actually, having an initiative is one thing, but setting out how it can actually work with some numbers behind it will be really critical. So I'm really interested to see that report when it's launched in Glasgow. Thank you very much. I've got some questions here, which I will come back to you. So get yourself ready. I'm going to come back to you in a little bit. Okay. We're now going to hand over to Catherine Dixon, who's Chief Counsellor for the Transition and Partnerships for the IEA. Over to you, Catherine.
Great, thank you. Our net zero report, which came out recently, and you can go on to the next slide, please, set out the unprecedented transformation that's going to be needed in our energy system. So in the near term, the pathway requires the immediate and massive deployment of all the available clean energy technologies, combined with a major push to accelerate innovation. So, renewables, obviously, massive role to play. And we see the share of renewables in total output for electricity going from 29% in 2020 to over 60% in 2030 and nearly 90% in 2050. And what that means in practical terms is annual additions of solar PV that reach 630 gigawatts by 2030, and those of wind reaching 390 gigawatts. And so for context, that is 4 times the record set in 2020. So for solar PV, it's equivalent to installing the world's current largest solar park roughly every day. So on to the next slide. So of course, the capacity is only one aspect of the transition. Investment in electricity networks is going to be crucial to achieving the transformation. Global electricity networks that took 130 years to build are going to need to more than double in total length by 2040, and then increase by another 25% by 2050. So total grid investment needs to rise to $820 billion by 2030 and $1 trillion in 2040. You can see that after that, investment falls back, and that's when electricity is fully decarbonised and the growth of renewables then slows to match demand growth. So there are 2 main challenges then to this problem. And if you go on to the next slide, the first one is investment. The investment challenge in grids mirrors the wider investment challenge in the transition. And the reality is that clean energy investments in the parts of the world that they're most needed have been stuck and actually been declining. We need a massive surge in clean energy investments to put emissions on a different course. By the end of the 2020s, annual capital spending on clean energy in these economies needs to expand by more than 7 times. So from less than 150 billion last year to over $1 trillion in 2030 if we're going to reach net zero. Now that's a really big shift. And of course, there's a range of barriers here, but we should underline that the key issue It's not the shortage of capital worldwide. There's plenty of capital around. The issue is in ensuring that investment finds its way to the countries, the sectors and the projects where it's most needed. So a big focus, and the first big focus that the international community has, is to unlock the investment that's needed. Now, there's obviously a lot of macroeconomic barriers in there, such as higher interest rates and the perception of risks by the private sector in certain markets. But from what we see, the biggest barrier really is getting the energy policy environment right in a lot of these countries to attract the private capital that's needed. And that's where we've been putting our biggest focus. So moving sort of more directly then onto grid integration. So the first big challenge, and you can go on to the next slide, please. The first big challenge, of course, is investment, but grids really are the key enabler for integrating variable renewable energy. But this isn't just about the hardware that's needed. Grids need to be supported by the procedures and the institutions that allow for the optimal use of the assets. And this is relevant both within countries and across borders. So the EU and US are good examples of regional integration. And the EU is, of course, highly unusual because it involves supranational jurisdiction. And so the priority now really is to support and accelerate regional efforts in other parts of the world. And looking at this from an international perspective, we have to recognize, as Craig alluded to, that regional integration can only really happen in the regions themselves. Because regions really will take different approaches, and it isn't an all or nothing choice. There really are, quite different models. At one end of the spectrum, you've got jurisdictions that remain independent. You've got cross-border integration that's managed through harmonized, bilateral or multilateral institutional and policy arrangements. And these kind of governance structures enable trade without sacrificing local independence over key policies, which is going to be important in some places. But at the other end of the spectrum, you can get single governance frameworks which are developed that encompass, all the relevant jurisdictions. And there, of course, independence is sacrificed in order to increase overall efficiency of trading and the system operation. So more integration results in more efficiency, but of course, more integration also depends on the political willingness for countries to really rely on each other, all regions. And that, of course, is a bigger political challenge. So regardless of the model of governance, political institutions have a key role to play here, both in enabling integration in the first place and then supporting overall coordination. Regulatory institutions are also important. They determine the rules for operations to ensure reliability, to allow local market participants to benefit fully from the gains of trade. And in many cases, cross-border integration is best supported by the development of regional regulatory institutions. We've seen in extreme cases, these can replace local regulatory institutions at the far end of the spectrum. Finally, market frameworks are also necessary to enable that trade. And again, how these market frameworks look in practice again depends significantly on the underlying structures, market structures of the interconnected jurisdictions. They can be simple, so you can have bilateral contracts for imported power. Alternatively, you can get complex frameworks, the development of regional power markets that allow for multilateral trading. And of course, the first option, you get simple, predictable power trading, but you lack that flexibility. And the second option, you get more flexibility, more optimal use of resources, but of course, it can expose local resources to increased competition. So if there's a single lesson for the governance of cross-border power system integration, it's this, and that's that regional integration is best enabled by the presence of capable regional institutions. So the biggest role of the international community really is not to try and impose solutions, but to try and encourage their development through strengthening regional institutional capacity. And that can be done obviously by sharing best practice and learning, providing better understanding of how the different models can work and the different levels of resource sharing that's required. So I just wanted to welcome the Greening the Grid initiative. I think international organizations can also help by creating stronger, forums of regulators and operators within those regions that are trying to come together and ensuring they've got access to more peer-to-peer learning. And finally, I just wanted to say that the international community can also help ensure that approaches are joined up. We did a study in Southeast Asia on renewable integration, which showed that if you do regional integration without ambitious targets for getting more renewables on the grid, then you can end up expanding the use of coal on the grid, given it can be of the lower, it's on the lower cost end of the spectrum after renewables. Conversely, renewables on their own just end up with curtailed power if you've not got integrated system. And if you just do coal phase out without fixing the investment environment or tackling the grid, then you're probably just going to end up with new coal power being built in the end. So I think that's just a lesson in the need for a joined up approach. We need grid integration efforts to be coupled with efforts to increase investment and with initiatives on coal phase out, all to be coordinated. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's very interesting. And I completely agree that regional integration has to be bought into and owned by those regional areas as well. They can't be imposed by another part of the world. I completely understand and completely agree where you come from there. And also that political institution, regulatory market is very different from where you are in the world. They're understanding the lay of the land today and then moving from there within those regions, absolutely important. And then interestingly, around the grid investment, significant sums of money are going to be needed. And where does that come from with interest rates? And how does that then protect ultimately the end consumer and the bill player? So I guess that sort of leads us quite neatly into the next speaker, which is Priyanka Wijayatunga, who is the Director of the South Asia Energy Division of the Asian Development Bank. To you, Priyanka.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Craig. At the outset, let me thank E3G and National Grid for inviting me to share ADB experience and thoughts in this webinar. ADB currently in the energy sector operations, we lend about $5 billion a year and mostly concentrated in the power sector. We have a little bit of gas sector operations, but mostly power sector. And half of this power sector lending goes into transmission and distribution or network services. This is the case across all ADB South Asian countries, that is Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. These investments mainly target, these network-related investments mainly target renewable energy evacuation, strengthening networks to absorb more and more renewable energy, and supply side energy efficiency and reliability improvement, basically targeting loss reduction and making networks smarter for more renewable energy absorption. And then, of course, necessary automation relating to that. And also, ADB support to bring together different sources of financing. As a development bank, we do not have adequate resources ourselves. We try to bring in our own sovereign financing. Then we have a non-sovereign financing window whom we work very closely with. And then other development partners, we co-finance with many other development partners in the region and across. And then different forms of climate financing like Clean Technology Fund, Green Climate Fund, and so on and so forth. Then also commercial financing to be brought into this sector. Let me, with that broad outline of what we are doing in ADB, let me take a few examples what we have been doing in South Asia. ADB has been a partner of the Government of India from early days preceding the National Solar Mission through financing the first ever solar park in India at Charanka in 2009. There was an overwhelming response from the private sector to the solar park concept. In fact, this was developed with the help of, in partnership with Clinton Foundation. Public sector provided land, site development, then ready transmission evacuation and standardized PPAs, etc. And this provided encouragement and useful inputs in the early days of the National Solar Mission. In Rajasthan, in partnership with DFID UK funded technical assistance, ADB supported the conceptualization of some of the initial work on large-scale solar parks. Subsequently, ADB in partnership with Clean Technology Fund put together a $500 million program that has helped with master plan design and development of multiple sector solar and wind parks in the deserts of Western Rajasthan. This included largest co-financing package of about $200 million of CTF, or Clean Technology Fund, that was mobilized to support this initiative. This program included flagship Badla park, now scaled up to about 2 gigawatts. And it had consistently set the benchmarks for competitive solar tariffs since phase 1 in 2013. Badla Solar Park model demonstrated the role of proper planning, optimal project sizing, credit enhancement through involving national off-takers, etc. And it could enhance natural advantages of a site that result in dramatic lowering of costs through competition. Challenges with facilitating unprecedented levels of renewable energy investment in remote regions, the operational challenges of managing renewable energy generation on a weak transmission network, and the evolving regulatory mechanisms to support capital-intensive transmission infrastructure, as well as helping financial turnaround of a transmission utility, were addressed during this program implementation. These were very good lessons. It also demonstrated the complementary role of state transmission utilities and central transmission utilities, as well as private sector transmission over time to support evacuation to national grid to help meet demand across India. We have had similar interventions since then, right throughout in India. If you take other countries, transmission and distribution investments, again, in the other countries, quite remarkable from our side. And in Nepal and Bhutan, we basically supported these two countries to evacuate hydropower into their own country and across the border. And in Nepal, Kaligandaki, Marshandi corridors, we strengthened transmission power evacuation of those two hydropower corridors towards the cross-border, eventually to push it across the border. And then solar and solar, wind, mini hydro, systems were supported in Sri Lanka. Again, transmission evacuation, automation, and the primary distribution strengthening, because most of the distributed renewable energy plants come on the primary distribution system, and we strengthen those systems in these countries. Then if you take Maldives, from 2014, we have been putting a lot of money in Maldives, mainly to bring in solar power and to take all these diesel sets off from the power system. And we have been strengthening the island grids to make sure that they are ready to absorb more and more solar power with efficient backup generation, and then energy management systems, storage, solar PV, and rehabilitation of the network. Then we have been supporting cross-border interconnections, Bangladesh, India, Bhutan, India, and we are looking at even Nepal, India, now the cross-border interconnections. All these countries, when it comes to future, all these countries have very ambitious clean energy targets. Therefore, network services will continue to have a very important and a central role to play. Wherever you have distributed generation, to bring them together and eventually to take it to the load centers, these network services will have a very important role to play. ADB will continue to support through various new and innovative interventions, improving the smartness of the grid, and things like bringing in energy storage with all the other possible clean energy financing partnerships, and then smart metering, and then how we can bring in things like demand response and microgrids in all these systems. And what are the challenges? Of course, we have challenges. The biggest challenge is, of course, as you heard from previous speakers, bring the policymakers and the utilities on board for these new developments, because they are generally slow to absorb this. And so our task as a development bank and our policy dialogue with these governments is quite critical to bring them on board. That's one of the challenges, and we have been handling it quite well. And then safeguard issues. We all can talk about renewable energy, then the safeguard issues are enormous sometimes when it comes to this renewable energy development. One good example is what we had in Sri Lanka, wind park development. It's actually in the middle of a bird migratory route. So we had to bring in all sorts of new technologies to make sure that this wind park can stand there without major safeguard issues. So we brought in radar-based bird detecting systems to switch off and switch on automatically the wind park when there is a bird migration season. Then also some other measures, the bird diverters on the transmission lines and so on. So safeguard issues are a challenge, and obviously we have adequate technology to help mitigate this, but we need to continue with those efforts. Thank you very much once again, and this is what we have been doing, and we will continue to do this for many years to come. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Prenta. That was really, really useful, and it's good to see that you are applying some of your financial logic into some hardcore sort of projects in the Asian area. That's really interesting. I'm going to start with you, actually. It sort of links back to something that sort of Catherine sort of mentioned. How do you, what more do you need, I guess, from the political leaders of the world to give you that certainty that the right thing to do is invest in green technologies, which might be a longer return, but you don't get that certainty, versus what you know you could get return on? How do you make those decisions? What more do you need from the political leaders today?
One thing, of course, generally the political leaders seem to be more or less aligned with this thinking going towards renewable energy, green grids, and so on. Sometimes the issue comes with the utilities, traditional utilities with all these engineers sitting there. I myself is an engineer. It's a bit difficult to change them. I can still remember in ADB in Sri Lanka, we started off, let's say, they said not more than 10% can be absorbed. As now we have almost about 20-30% coming in without major issue. So what we really need is actually more and more demonstration projects, if we can do, and also some analytics. We have to do analysis and provide adequate soft support to show them that these are not issues, and then they build their confidence as we go along. That's what we did, for instance, in Sri Lanka. We have been supporting them to look at the stability of the system, to simulate the system properly in detail, so that they can be confident that they can absorb more and more renewable energy. And now, for instance, recently we had a blackout in Sri Lanka, and they basically attributed that to more and more renewable energy coming in. So we are now actually getting consultants to look at these issues. So I think that confidence building is really required, and that takes time. Probably not so much of money, but basically time and expertise. That's what is important. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Great. And so just next question, which is sort of superior one for you, Jagjeet, around not necessarily international solar rights, but recognizing it's looking broader than just solar technology. But there's a question here from Legal Heli in Korea. What about the emerging view that disposing solar panels and wind turbines will soon become a sustainability problem? And I guess I'm linking that into the feasibility and technical study you're talking about. Is that looking at just getting one sun, one world, one grid off the ground, or is it looking at the whole life cycle? It's interesting to understand where you guys are on that.
So that's an interesting question. Keeping aside one sun, one world, or any interconnections, just the growth of these technologies and the way power plants are coming in for solar, whether it's grid connected or distributed, and I can speak more, with authority on solar coming from Solar Alliance, that this issue is now risen to the top in terms of life cycle analysis. At ISA, we are doing a detailed study with UNEP and this year on circular economy and life cycle analysis, waste management of solar power plants. And we hope to bring again recommendations to our governing body meeting in October, so that we start nudging policymakers, politicians, first awareness, but also best practice guidelines and some national recommendations how to deal with these issues. And we are looking at also from a perspective of design, material, and then end of the cycle management of waste. Then you go into other issues in terms of the base material which goes into manufacturing, and whether there are alternatives, whether they are R&D stage, or can we really change the production, the raw material that's required. So just to say, this issue is on our radar. The growth has been phenomenal of solar sector, and it would be more. We are looking into it, and there is increasing awareness around these issues. And we will play our part in the sense of bringing all the member countries together to agree on various guidelines and parameters how to manage this issue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, completely agree with the answer there. Just a quick question, actually, just picking up on Catherine. I recognise sort of the role of the IEAs involving, and Cathy talked about your net zero report, which was very well received when it came out last month. From the IEA's perspective, how do you view that idea of global governance to accelerate this big change? I guess some of the work I've been looking at, so some of the initiatives, there's lots of initiatives going on, there's lots of governance. What's needed, and what's the IEA view? How it all hangs together? What's needed to take it forward?
Do you mean specifically on kind of grids and power, or generally on energy?
Just accelerating the energy transition, I think it's broader than just grid. I think grids are a part of it, but I think it is broader than just grids.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've sort of bought in really to the kind of sector by sector approach. I think what's needed is, really depends on the sector. And I think, the NDC approach to the energy transition, where, everything's looked at quite nationally with national targets, I think is sort of doomed for failure if it's not supplemented by additional kind of mechanisms. Because of course it can work in some contexts where you've got nationally protected markets, particularly, power or passenger transport. But even as we've heard today, some of the issues around power are international. But where you've got internationally traded sectors, that's where it becomes really, really difficult. I mean, how can you possibly, decarbonize your shipping or aviation sector, or even your steel sector, without having some kind of international coordination? And I think the kind of the nature of that international coordination and the extent to which it's sort of hardwired or more collaborative and cooperative, I think again depends on the sector. So in some sectors, I think we probably need greater regulation. I mean, imagine if we tried to get rid of CFCs in fridges by sort of having lots of meetings and dialogues about capacity building. I mean, we would have never got there. But whereas when you listen to the issues on grid integration, it's much more about trying to get that sort of deep political integration in regions. So I think there is no sort of single governance for it. But what you can see in the international system is that we've got fragmented energy institutions, fragmented governance, and we've got a sort of overall climate architecture that focuses probably a bit more on targets than action, and not really on driving the kind of coordinated regulation or approaches. I'm sorry if that sounds a bit too pessimistic, but I think there is a bit of a problem to be solved here that goes beyond kind of pushing for more ambition.
Yeah, no, thank you, Catherine. I tend to agree with some of that, because I think you're right. There's lots of good things going on, but it can't just be done one to one. It's got to be one to many because of the natural physics of how the electricity system operates in the first place. When you think of it as simply as that, it just can't be country to country. It's got to be country to many. I think we've got maybe have time for one more question there. So I might just come back to Jagdeep, actually. There's one here regarding ISA member countries. To what extent are greening domestic grids of ISA member countries part of the LCAW? Are there any broad targets or goals for upgrading domestic power systems?
So the way ISA works is encouraging a voluntary domestic action, and we kind of split the whole solar agenda into decentralized off-grid, but also utility scale solar parks. We are working in countries like Mali, Niger, and a few others in Africa to set up bigger solar plants, utility scale, where part of the electricity generated would be transferred cross-border to other member countries. So in a sense, if you see the current generation capacity of these countries, in addition of a couple of hundred more megawatts of solar coming in, you are making a significant shift in greening the grid, if you will, changing the whole energy mix of the grid, because overall capacity is not that big either. You're talking about countries where still, sometimes 60 to 80% population don't have access to electricity. So there are issues where we look at it more holistically in terms of what does the country want, whether access is their issue, as security is their issue, energy security, energy transition, or all the above, and you prioritize how you support member countries. We don't have a singular agenda, if you will, a bumper sticker, green the grids through solar, but what we are saying is in enhance solar generation capacity in your countries for the needs you want. And one of the solutions there is interconnecting various grids where you have access capacity generation, or economically it will make more sense to produce more and then have cross-border trades. So it's all of the above, because countries are at various stages of development, and you cannot just leapfrog their political priorities just overnight. We need to build capacity. We need to, as Priyantha was saying, a lot to be done. Frankly, I'm not sure that if tomorrow all politicians decide that we should achieve net zero in next 10 years, it will happen, because you have to take the whole country along, take the whole systems along, engineers, financiers, policymakers, public, everybody along to meet their needs. So I think we have to work at all levels, and that's what we are trying to do. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for that. And I think that concludes our section. I mean, that's just a big thanks to Jajit, Catherine, and Priyantha for sitting on this presentation and giving us their views of what's going on in the world. I think the conclusion for me, there's lots of really good stuff going on. There's almost a need to agree how to take things forward, as opposed to agree what that thing looks like for now. And also work out how can you share some of that better practice across at the global level, also the regional level as well, it sounds like. But I think ultimately it's all heading towards some really big announcements, which sound quite exciting for COP26 actually. So I can't wait to get my ticket to that and hopefully come along and listen to some of these launches. So with that, I'll conclude the Green Grid Initiatives section and pass back to Nick for conclusions. Nick.
Thanks, Craig.
Great. Thanks a lot to all the panelists and to Craig. That was a great session. I think started to do what we want to do in London Climate Action Week, which was kind of out some of the real practical and gritty issues behind the initiatives. We will run and be inside initiatives, but initiatives on their own do not make things happen. So I thought I'd just go through some of the takeaways I took from this, and perhaps leave us with the next session or the road to COP. So what have we heard? I mean, the first one is that this is not a technical issue. Political will is critical, and we're seeing political will behind some big initiatives like the Green Grids Alliance or on solar, but that's even more important at the national level. How do you get that kind of clear pathway which gives the regulators and all the people a way of organizing? But also, how do you get rid of things that are stopping? So for those who don't know, the Energy Charter Treaty in Europe is under huge pressure as seen a vehicle for stopping the transition through its provisions on investor-state dispute resolution. So there are things we have to unravel politically, as well as things we have to build. And that leads to the second point that came through, which is about pace. I think everybody sees the need for pace to keep in front of demand growth, as again, it's demand growth for electricity, just in terms of development, but also in terms of electrification. And that's where the role of efficiency. So we can't just talk about grids, we need to talk about that whole system approach. And we need to talk about how do we create the space to make the change. And that's also one of the real drivers for interconnectors to allow countries to import and export power. These are critical in many regions, particularly for smaller countries who can't do internal balancing. But there's high politics around this. We see in Europe, even between France and Spain, for years, Spain was less connected into Europe's grid than the UK was because of border politics, because it touched on fundamental security and economic issues. And there is a massive history of failed mega projects like Desert Tech, which attracted huge political attention, but really delivered very little in terms of practical action. And we need to be aware, therefore, of the real issues. And I was interested about how do we support those big interconnectors, regional or pan-regional issues. And part of that, and part of this whole project, came up very strongly, was the need to change mindsets. And I'm an engineer too, and engineers are often called conservative, though of course they also invent all the new things. But this idea that I also think regulators are often, and to be honest, think tanks are often some of the most conservative forces we meet. We need to change the whole system. We need different regulations, markets, technologies, and actors in the system, and move to a real systemic reform. Not have to keep on making the case for reform. Everybody should realize the only way we meet that IEA scenario is by fundamental reform. Just look at the numbers. And part of that is reform in the systems around this, particularly in finance. So we saw the numbers of 3 times as much investment in grids globally, 7 times in some of the critical regions which really need this fast. That's going to take a fundamental change. There's some really interesting initiatives like the taxonomy for grids, which hopefully, if the finance says, if you've got a good grid plan, a good energy transition plan, you can get more and cheaper finance. That'll start to create a virtuous circle into the economic decision makers to actually undertake these reforms, because countries always have many things they need to reform, not just for climate. There's a competition for that political energy and administrative energy moving forward. And underneath that kind of the core attention is the need to share skills. As someone said, the politicians could all decide to go net zero tomorrow. Would we still be able to align the skills and systems and understanding to do that? How do we pilot the new systems? How do we improve peer-to-peer training? And I think that's a critical part of the Green Grids initiative, is building those peer-to-peer networks. Some exist, some have existed for a long time, but I think they need to be deeper. And I think the last one is on the building, is the coming back to build a case for such large reform. You need to think beyond the usual energy system cost saving cases. Certainly it's something we've seen in the North Seas case, where going beyond that and talking about economic opportunity, the role in industrialization. For example, in North Africa, more green power means more access to European markets, particularly with the carbon border measure. So again, wrapping this in the more economic recovery, macroeconomic analysis, not just a narrow energy system analysis, can help, garner that huge effort which is needed to change the system at the pace we need. So summarizing, we've got 4 factors at once: the pace of decarbonisation, the growth of demand everywhere, the need for radical market regulatory and technological reform, and the need to integrate across sectors, regions, and countries. So to do that, we need to build some institutions that came up both within and between countries to really drive that faster. So do we need more grid diplomacy if this interconnection is important? Which country has got a grid ambassador? Some countries have hydrogen ambassadors, lots of countries have climate ambassadors. Which countries have grid ambassadors to help actually sew together those bilateral and multilateral pieces? We need to bring the public with us. How do we actually communicate to the public and publics that this is going to be fair and it's not going to damage other things they care about, like the environment, which has been a major constraint in lots of countries we work in to move forward. So how do we build that in from the start? How do we build that outreach and the community around this shift? And finally, as we go into COP, where we've got the attention of leaders, is there really enough institutional, financial firepower behind driving these changes? And I think that I would take from the general panel, the answer is no. And we need to really think about how we take some of the initiatives we've got and really put muscle behind them. There's a few things coming up. So the US has relaunched the Major Economies Forum. Could that play a role, even at leaders level, looking at the grids and the energy transition and grids? The G20. Should the G20 this year, we have an energy ministers meeting coming up, surely the G20 should have a position on the need for this fundamental transformation and the role of interconnection and grids in that. At COP26, we will see the Energy Transitions Campaign and Council come forward with lots of work in this area. That's where the Green Grids Initiative is linked to. It's a powerful place. Where does that go out of Glasgow? Glasgow will be a beginning, not an end. There's a lot of focus here on regional fora, whether it's in Europe and the North Sea, Southeast Asia, the African Union, SADC. How do we support those regional fora to move forward? And then finally, I think, certainly for us, we see the focus on some of the institutions, the multilateral development banks, the bilateral development banks, as real focuses for the public-private finance for the technical assistance moving forward. Should we have a much stronger approach to driving these changes, particularly on difficult infrastructure like grids and smart from those institutions? Then we're saying we monitor their progress. We think they could do a lot more, particularly on the demand side, actually, to move the efficiency around. So an agenda for action which could really make a difference. Lots to do over the next period, but I think coming back again and again to saying, are the institutions we're building to support this operating anywhere near the pace and scale needed? And how can we harness political attention to give permissions and capacity to drive that forward? So thank you very much. It's been a great conversation. There's lots more to do, but I think it really laid out both the challenge and the opportunity of the transition and the role of grids and grid integration and system integration in that. Thank you very much.